Hey everyone, welcome to our next session. We are focusing on the theme of Kingdom of God. Our host text comes from Acts chapter 12. This is the story of Peter being imprisoned after James, the brother of John, son of Zebedee, has been beheaded by Herod, the ruling Herod. At the time, this would be Herod Antipas. I'm sorry, I do believe that's Herod Agrippa. Apologies. So, as you saw, imprisonment for the gospel was the name of that particular lesson. I am repackaging that to further the theme that we've been talking about with other lessons, and the fact that Luke has laid down several examples of the death and resurrection cycle, even though not every one of those was a literal death. It was a picture of death, and the deliverance that came from that was a picture of new life, which, of course, is what is heavily wrapped up in the core of what resurrection means and why it's so significant. And that, of course, is all in anticipation of the culminating moment when Jesus dies and is resurrected. That is how the kingdom itself actually winds up coming into existence, as goes its literal moment of inauguration, as he is installed as Israel's king through his death, vindicated through his resurrection, and now truly installed as the cosmic king ruling upon David's throne at the right hand of the Ancient of Days, which had to have happened all through the death and resurrection. And so Luke continues this theme through many more examples of it in the book of Acts, and all to show that the kingdom continues to grow in its veracity and impact and dominion through these death and resurrection cycles. And so for Peter to be imprisoned, the understanding from the context is quite clear. Herod wants to kill Peter as well. He is seen as one of the key ringleaders of the Jesus movement, and he saw that it pleased the people who are opposing the movement when he put James to death. So, of course, he wants to wait till after Passover to not create more of a martyr complex for Peter in the process, but we know this is not Peter's time to die. So paralleling the story of Jesus with Peter in this particular moment, there are several moments where the stories actually overlap, considering the fact that both of them are imprisoned during the days of unleavened bread. Now, I have to go through this a little more quickly than I would like because this is a 10-minute vignette, but you'll spend some time with it, hopefully chew on it. And when I get to unpack it later in a 30-minute session, it'll make more sense as I get to draw it open a little longer. So then we see that Jesus is actually abandoned by everybody during his trial, but Peter actually isn't. So there's a bit of a change here in this. Instead, Peter is surrounded, not physically, but spiritually in prayer by other people as they are all pent up in Rhoda's house, praying fervently for Peter's release. And then an angel actually comes to release Peter out of prison. But Jesus' story doesn't end with his abandonment. After his trial, even though he is put to death, he is later vindicated. He's resurrected. This completes the Exodus forecasted in Luke 9 at the transfiguration moment when Elijah and Moses are literally talking to Jesus about the resurrection he is going to launch in Jerusalem when he goes there for his death. And Peter is resurrected from his death sentence in prison. Think of this much in the way that the writer of Hebrews talks about Isaac being resurrected from the dead of sorts when his father Abraham was going to offer him. And he says, indeed, Abraham did receive him back from the dead in a sort of way. So, of course, the first people to see Jesus after his resurrection were women. The first person to encounter Peter after his release or resurrection moment was a woman, a little girl by the name of Rhoda. The women run to tell disciples of Jesus's resurrection, as Rhoda runs to tell the others who are praying at the moment that Peter has indeed been delivered from jail as they were praying and waiting for. Then Jesus disappears from the disciples for an indeterminate period before he chooses to reappear amongst them. Peter weirdly does the same thing. He meets with him just for a brief moment, and then he goes to what Luke says, another place. And then for a time, Peter doesn't appear back in the story again until we get to the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15. So bracketing all of this in here, this is important to see that this was indeed a resurrection moment for Peter, where as the Lord delivered him, it furthered the kingdom with respect to what comes on the heels of this after what Peter has already done. And of course, the church is strengthened by virtue of the fact of Peter's release. But now there is also a sub-theme going on here. And I think it's important for us to appreciate this because in large part, what it does is help us also see that Luke is embedding the Exodus theme a little bit more here with respect to the way this mirrors larger Exodus-like stories in Scripture, right? Because if you think about it, right before this particular story, we have this prophet named Agabus who predicts a worldwide famine before Peter then winds up going into prison and his fellow disciple or apostle James was beheaded. You think about this in the vein of how Joseph also predicted before Pharaoh a worldwide famine. Now, stop for a second here. I'm going to pause on that story. I don't want to confuse you, but I do want to also show you how this prior Exodus ark concept also parallels with other stories. Go down to this first gray block right here and look at the concept of an angel leading Peter out of prison. I didn't mention it then because I wanted to introduce the concept of previous Exodus arcs, Lot being led along with his daughters and originally his wife before she was turned into a pillar of salt out of the city of Sodom was indeed an Exodus moment for them because the city itself is being exiled to divine punishment as God sends fire and brimstone to consume the city. And so Peter was let out of prison by an angel, just as Lot was let out of Sodom by an angel. So if you think about that for a moment, if both of those are Exodus arcs, what does that say about the actual city itself? Excuse me, of Jerusalem at this time. This is a concept I've laid down for you in previous lessons in other intensives, where the writer Matthew, the first gospel we encounter, is making it very clear in his introduction to Jesus' story through his birth narrative, with the way he pictures Herod the Great and all that Jesus is indeed, and not only just a new Moses, but this is also a reverse image of how Israel has become a new Egypt, a spiritually tyrannical place, such that Messiah himself is not even safe there, and he has to find refuge in the place that was their former oppressors, both physically and spiritually, that being Egypt. Another example I would give you is to talk, of course, about the story of Israel being led out of Egypt by the angel of the Lord who was present in the pillar of cloud and fire. And then, of course, Joseph. Joseph, in his own story, in a sense, is resurrected from his death sentence in prison when he is brought out to then go stand before Pharaoh and then is exalted to the high position of Pharaoh's advisor and essentially a king-like figure over the land. So these Exodus arcs here are just pointing us back to the concept that we're supposed to see the image now of Jerusalem being essentially a new Egypt. So let's go back up here to this moment of Agabus acting almost like a new Joseph figure, predicting a famine. Then there is another figure actually called Joseph. His name is Barnabas for the rest of the story, but he's first introduced to us as Joseph. Barnabas and Paul descend to Jerusalem. We're supposed to understand Jerusalem kind of being pictographically figured here as Egypt to bring aid to Yahweh's people, because Agabus said there was a famine. The famine moment has come, and now Joseph and Paul descend down into Jerusalem to bring the aid because no one else is going to help them. They hate the Christians and they want to do everything they can to extinguish their presence. And so by virtue of that, they would see this as a grand opportunity to starve them out. But the Lord will not let that happen as he sends aid through the Joseph of the Old Testament, now a Joseph figure of the New Testament. But while Paul and Barnabas are there in Jerusalem, it happens that Herod simultaneously actually imprisons and kills James, brother of John, and then Peter. So all of this is supposed to lead us to the concept that Jerusalem is a new Sodom and a new Egypt, and Herod is a new Pharaoh. The New Testament ends with the same concept. This is the very thing that John in the Revelation is telling us, because he mentions the fact that Jesus was crucified in the city that is known as Sodom and Egypt. Jesus was not crucified in either of those places. Egypt's not a city, it's a country, and Sodom is destroyed. He, of course, was crucified in and around Jerusalem. Those words are code words speaking about the debauchery of what Jerusalem was becoming in the time of this story and had become by AD 70 when destroyed by the Romans. So therefore, we must understand Israel is poised to serve the nations and to bring them into the kingdom. So therefore, they have to be ransomed out of this, right? That's why God is destroying the old Israel that wants nothing to do with his Messiah and revitalizing Israel through the remnant of Jews who will follow Jesus as Messiah and the Gentiles who will come alongside them. So to complete this concept a little more, you actually notice that soon afterwards, there's a fight here going on between Herod and a neighboring kingdom. And the dispute itself actually causes some of Herod's soldiers to die. This in some way actually causes a mimicking of the death of Pharaoh's armies when they were drowned in the Red Sea. And then think about it. Joseph, who of course is Barnabas, and Saul, which in a sense, Saul is kind of representing the church, makes an exodus out of Jerusalem. And again, Jerusalem is pictographically understood as Egypt. They go back to Antioch to begin the mission to conquer Canaan, the Gentile world. Well, I'd love to spend more time on that, and I will when I get to my 30-minute unpacking of this, but just think about it from this perspective. Jesus was inaugurating a new conquest era. In Matthew's Gospels, perhaps where this is most clear, he dies as the new Moses to be resurrected as the new Joshua figure. We talked about that as our last lesson from the last quarterly intensive. With respect to that, this concept is being carried forward by Luke, even though he wasn't the one that actually brought that up. But he does embed a deep seated theme of the Exodus from Luke 9 all the way up to the end of Luke 24. And this is what he's broadcasting here. With the Exodus in the Old Testament doesn't end until they conquer the land. This is a conquest that's going to take over every place where human beings dwell, where all image bearers live, so for the sake of them having the chance to enter into the kingdom. And so Jerusalem is poised for destruction. The Romans will come, as Jesus said, within a generation and wipe Jerusalem off the map. Therefore, Israel's new base of operations is going to be moved out of there as a joint body between Jew and Gentile, now in the city of Antioch, where they are sending missionaries, Jews first, and then probably later Gentiles, to go and plant churches in other places and start the mission of bringing the Gentiles into the kingdom. So hopefully that's helpful. We'll talk about that more later on. Thanks for listening.